all of this has been really good for me to listen to, but focused on the freshwater environment. And that's primarily where we do our work. And we think, often I think we fall into this trap where we think that that's the only thing we have control over, and the marine environment might be a dominating force that we can't do anything about. But I've often thought that we do have control over the condition of fish as they go out to the ocean, and we're going to learn a little bit about the ocean environment today, just to have a better understanding of some of the challenges that these fish face. So in order to do that, we're going to have Nate Mantua come up and talk to us. He's a Ph.D. research scientist at NOAA Fisheries at the Science Center down in Santa Cruz, Southwest Fisheries Science Center. He's a climate scientist with a research focused on climate dynamics, climate impacts on natural resources, and the use of climate information in resource management. Much of his work has focused on climate, marine life, and fisheries in the North Pacific Ocean and Western North America, including understanding climate impacts on Pacific salmon ecology and salmon fisheries. Nate is a former associate professor of the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences and a founding member and co-director of the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington. And if anybody has heard of this thing called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO, Dr. Mantua was instrumental in kind of discovering that and developing that. And his paper is one that whenever we talk about the PDO and papers, that's the one we cite. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Mantua. And
yeah, so I'm going to talk about what our fish are experiencing once they leave the fresh water and get out into the Pacific. And just like in populations in watersheds, they are using the ocean in different ways, depending on their river of origin, sometimes the life history type, and the population group. This cartoon is one that gives a general idea about where West Coast Chinook salmon go when they're at sea. And you can see there's sort of two groups that really stand out. There's these far migrating fish that mostly originate from the rivers from about the middle of Oregon north. And then there are the California stocks that stay pretty close to home. And you can see that the sort of lighter green set of arrows depicts, what's known from ocean fishery recoveries of coded wire tags and some genetic stock ID of Klamath and Trinity Basin fish. So their ocean distribution typically about Central Oregon down to about Monterey Bay. Central Valley Chinook salmon tend to be a little bit further to the south, down as far as Point Conception, Santa Barbara area, and as far north as about the Oregon border. But these can vary, and there are individual fish that are strained from these patterns as well. And sometimes that's a year effect when conditions are especially good in the south, or maybe especially good up north. And if we looked at coho salmon, the kind of Southern Oregon, Northern California coho have a similar ocean distribution to what you see for the Chinook here. They tend to be about Central Oregon down into the central part of the California current. Why are the California fish staying home? Well, it's a super productive part of the North Pacific Ocean. And the maps on the left are surface current maps for a winter season and then spring season. And there's a dramatic transition that coincides with the shift in the prevailing wind field. So we go from our winter with frequent storms, bringing southwesterly winds. And you can see that this comes at a time when the surface currents of the ocean also have nearshore currents that go from south to north. There's a Davidson current, that's called the DC on the map, and a less organized north to south flow further offshore. In the spring, after the North Pacific high pressure system in the atmosphere sets up and our storms shut off, we have a lot of wind out of the northwest. I grew up in Bodega Bay. Some people call that Bodega Bay because it seems like the wind blows every day from about March until September. And that is true in a lot of years. And that is really important for structuring the coastal ocean and enriching it through this coastal upwelling process. The surface winds are dragging the surface water both to the south and offshore, and it's replaced by deeper, colder, nutrient-rich water that keeps fertilizing the upper ocean in the sunlit portion and makes for this super productive marine ecosystem where subarctic animals like Pacific salmon and steelhead can thrive. And you can see this in a pair of sea surface temperature maps. It's just pick a single year, January 2010 at the left, depicting a typical winter ocean where the isotherms show the coldest water in the north, warmer to the south, which you'd expect, just based on length of day. And the isotherms are more or less east to west during the winter time. So it is pretty close to energy balance with the sun's input at the surface, but it's very different in the spring and into the early summer. You can see that there's that blue patch that ranges from Central Oregon down to about Monterey Bay. That is the core of the most intense upwelling zone. That's where the surface winds tend to be most persistent and strong in that spring-summer period. It's also where we have the fog, because that fog is interacting with the surface ocean. It's moist, it's cold, and it gets this trapping lid on it from the high pressure above. And it just creates this much cooler maritime climate that makes the inland climate so different than coastal climate in California in summer. But that doesn't always play out, right? We've had a whole series of years with hot weather on the coast, with a really warm ocean all the way up to the beaches. And this has been especially true in the last 10 years that you probably all remember. The warm blob starting in the fall of 2013. It really started offshore in the Gulf of Alaska. And then it expanded and it came onshore in the fall of 2014, especially in a really dramatic way. And that kind of merged with warm water that was off the coast of Baja in Southern California that was formed sort of on its own during that same period. And into 2015, the entire Northeast Pacific had reached just incredibly warm temperatures from Alaska all the way down to Baja, offshore to Hawaii. And this is now thought to be, one of the biggest marine heat waves ever recorded. And it persisted for about 2.5 years, starting in the summer of 2014, going into the spring of 2016, affecting the coastal zone and really overlaying all of this ocean habitat for West Coast salmon and having dramatic impacts on marine life and fisheries. And then we have had a whole series of similar but not the same kind of marine heat waves. And I've had other maps from especially summer and fall of 2019, 2020, 2021. You see these really big patches where the darkest colors are, indicating vast areas of the ocean where the temperatures are 2 or 3 degrees centigrade above the long-term average. So hitting record territory repeatedly in recent years. And again, having big disruptions in marine life. Not all of these have come right into the coastal zone where our salmon tend to be concentrated. For steelhead, on the other hand, some of our steelhead are offshore migrators, we know, and they are probably experiencing really unusual ocean conditions in the Gulf of Alaska or south of the Aleutians, out in those offshore subarctic waters. And for the California current system, there has been extensive monitoring for decades now, going back to the collapse of the Pacific sardine fishery in the 1940s in Central California. That's launched a whole series of different ocean investigations. So there's been a pretty solid understanding about what happens to the ocean food web when we go between these warm and cold states. And before 2014, we would frequently talk about El Nino and how does El Nino affect the California current. And this cartoon was actually drawn in a book that NOAA put out about El Nino back in the 1990s. But it still holds pretty well, I think, that in the picture in the middle, showing a happy seagull on a nest of eggs, abundant forage fish, a California sea lion up in the upper ocean, weakly stratified upper ocean that's relatively cool, lots of plankton, lots of food, a nutrient-rich food web, and everybody's happy. And you compare that with what happens during the warm years, and what typically happens is the surface ocean becomes very warm and it becomes a lower density than those deeper layers, so much so that even if the wind blows, it has trouble tapping into that cold, nutrient-rich layer below, and it cuts off the nutrient supply. So you're just kind of recycling warm water in an already depleted upper ocean, and the bottom of the food web falls out. We also know that it's not just less food, but it's also a change in the community structure, that the lower nutrient concentrations tend to come with smaller planktonic species, both in phytoplankton and zooplankton, and there's lower lipids. And then we also have fish that are moving that can include pretty dramatic species differences, things that you might expect to see off of Baja California, or offshore waters in Southern California, like swordfish, sailfish, and opa. These are actually sightings off of the Oregon coast in 2015 and 16 during that incredible marine heat wave. Something that happened in that year was a real scarcity of food throughout the system in the California current. So California sea lions, which breed in the Channel Islands in Southern California, and then typically will go out and forage throughout the California current during the summertime, they really invaded the lower Columbia River that year in a way that has just not been seen before. Not just the not breeding males, but also females. And all of a sudden they had hundreds of animals in the lower Columbia River preying upon sturgeon, steelhead, and salmon at rates that just hadn't been seen before. Ocean surveys off the Oregon and Washington coast saw a lot of skinny coho and Chinook juveniles. So you could tell they were having problems growing out there. And, a whole host of other warm water species moving into higher latitudes and inshore habitats that are where the salmon have to be. And if you talk to fishermen, some of the things were observed, that the adult Chinook that were targets in the fishery in these years were at greater depths. Like, they're still out there, they're just deeper water. I know in Monterey Bay, they were sitting on the bottom in 300 feet of water out of that warm surface layer. And just looking at some of your actually fish return data for the Trinity, you can see there's sort of a hole in salmon returns in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18 that's pretty common on the West Coast, coinciding not just with these really extreme ocean conditions, but also the extreme freshwater conditions that were happening at a lot of West Coast rivers in 2015 especially. So among the different efforts to try and understand ocean conditions for salmon on the West Coast is one that's been concentrated along Newport, Oregon, a whole series of nearshore stations where they have done hydrographic and plankton tows going back into the 60s, actually, with Bill Peterson in his graduate school days, and then picked up again in the 1990s on a more regular basis and then sustained through time. So here's what they call their stoplight table. And the first year in the stoplight table is 1998, and it has indicators for a whole bunch of things. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, this top two columns, a kind of a December to March and May to September, so 2 halves of the year. This one is an El Nino index, some local measures of ocean temperature at the surface and depth, salinity, and then some biological indicators, looking at copepod, species richness, the northern lipid-rich community, a southern lipid-poor community, a date of the spring transition as measured by the changes in the zooplankton community composition, and a whole host of other kind of biological indicators. And I'll just draw your attention to the color scheme. 1998 was, of course, one of these incredible El Nino events. It started in 1997 and carried into the spring of 98. And there's a lot of red boxes indicating, something that was not like a subarctic, super productive, cold ocean for salmon when they enter as juveniles. And you can see a lot of red stripes here, 2003, 4, 5. Another set of years. This 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, just a lot of red in all the indicators. And then we get here to 21, 22, 23, and it's more mixed. In fact, it's sort of a mix in both the large scale indicators in the climate, some of the local things showing still warm in 2022 and 2023 especially, And the biological indicators were sort of mixed, that it didn't flip back to sort of the cold, productive state that you would expect to see if some things, like La Nina years in 2021 and 22, had an influence along our coast that made it cold and productive here. So from this view, we've had a rough decade for the most part, just the 10-year periods leading up to now. And other information that's even more directly relevant for Klamath and Trinity salmon comes from a Trinidad head sampling line. So Eric Bjorkstedt, who is a NOAA employee based at Humboldt State University, he has been running a similar ocean survey program, going out in a small boat about monthly for about 16 years now. And you could see the sampling stations for the Trinidad headline are just within about 30 kilometers of the coast. And the continental shelf is narrow there, so it goes off the shelf break into deeper water at the outermost station. And it's a place where in this middle panel, you can see that there's just a lot of diversity in kind of ocean conditions. In this case, it's sea surface temperature that is a product of the interaction of surface winds and the ocean response and how the coastline is shaped. So you get these different plumes of cold water peeling off the coast and eddies and jets forming in places like Cape Mendocino and Cape Blanco and even Trinidad Head in a pretty regular fashion because of this interaction and this large scale factors. And they are doing these CTD casts to look at hydrographic properties, kind of get a curtain view of what the upper ocean looks like, and towing these bongo nets vertically to get samples of copepods, these little crustacean zooplankton, and then the larger ones, krill. And this, again, is especially important because we know from our ocean trawl surveys that we're targeting juvenile salmon early in their marine life that a lot of the Klamath Trinity salmon are caught in this area during the midsummer. These surveys, when they were conducted, were done in June and July. And you can see the Klamath Trinity fish mostly, hanging out here. This is 2010, 11, and 12. Central Valley Chinook being more distributed, from about Point Arena down to Pigeon Point. So close to their ocean entry points, not too big a surprise when these are small fish. And there has been a lot of work done on our coast all the way up into British Columbia, suggesting that the early marine period is a critical period, that these fish, they enter the ocean at a size, they're vulnerable to a lot of predators, seabirds, other fish, marine mammals. And one of their challenges is to grow rapidly out of these really vulnerable windows of predation. So if they can find food and avoid predators and get big, they can perhaps survive to those older age classes and make it back either into fisheries or to the spawning grounds. So the Trinidad headline has its first data points here in 2008, the last one on this graphic, 2020. And here's just a whole collection of different krill species. One of the most important is this Euphausia pacifica. It's one of the largest, and Thysoanassa spinifera. Some of these are especially abundant during the cold years, and those are the ones in blue, sort of indicators of a cold water mass, and others are indicators of the warm. This is sort of the warm blob collection of species. There's this one, Nyctiphone simplex, is thought to be an El Nino indicator, suggestive of southern water moving up into the Trinidad headline area. And this one, Euphausia recurva, is one that is suggestive of offshore species that are typically out in more subtropical waters that come inshore if that upwelling process is not effectively, keeping them at bay. Over here is another species that has become persistently observed along the Pacific coast, especially from Oregon south. It's called pyrosomes. This is kind of a food web dead end, right? They're planktivores, just gelatinous goo. If you've been out in the ocean, you might have had it on your gear or caught fish that coughed them up. I know in Monterey Bay last year, every rockfish I caught seemed to be just loaded with these things. And we have rockfish surveys that are sampling along the whole California coast and seeing that, yeah, this is pretty common, that this is a species that prior to 2013 had been seen only off of Southern California and Baja out in subtropical waters offshore. But since that time, they have been abundant to varying levels year after year. So they haven't left in spite of the end of some of these marine heat waves. And something that Eric shared with me that I wanted to share with you is an indicator for Klamath salmon recruitment deviations. So he's compared here a length anomaly in krill against Chinook salmon recruitment deviations for the Klamath for this 2008 to 2019 brood years. And there is this intriguing relationship. So krill size is indicator for how well Klamath salmon do. He needs to dig into this more to better understand what this might mean. We know that juvenile salmon are caught with krill in their stomachs, so that's one of the diet items that they will target if it's available. They're generalists, they eat pretty much anything they can fit into their stomach when it's available, but this is an especially kind of nutritionally high value food item if it's there. And then another thing that has emerged in recent years that has taken up more and more of my attention in the last 4 years is thiamine deficiency. And in 2020, in January, I remember an email circulating with a memo that Scott Foote had written from the Fish Health Lab at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, indicating that they had seen a lot of early fry mortality in Central Valley hatcheries that year, shortly after the fry were ponded. And they, this video to play, they saw fry that were both dying at high rates and also swimming in really unusual patterns, corkscrews on the bottom, laying on the bottom. They couldn't find a pathogen associated with this at multiple hatchery programs, but when they tested them with a thiamine bath, the fish responded really dramatically within a few hours, and they had lost their symptoms. They looked fine. They started feeding. They survived to become smolts. And that was really definitive that this is thiamine deficiency. It had never been documented in California. It's not clear if it was here before because nobody really looked, aside from a little bit of sampling done in 2010 and 11 with winter run Chinook salmon. But what we see now after 4 years of sampling California hatcheries is that it is widespread in the Central Valley in each of the last 4 years in fall run, spring run, winter run, and late fall run, especially in the winter run and late fall run. And it's become a bigger problem in the Klamath and Trinity in this 4-year period. In 2020, our first collection of samples showed very little. The color scheme here shows the lowest values. And we've come up with these impact categories based on survival studies done on Central Valley Chinook salmon. So we're using the same criteria here for your fish. And what you see is that the coho especially have had the lowest thiamine conditions in recent years. 2022 was especially bad, but still pretty bad in 2023. And steelhead have also had really low thiamine values, and that's especially true for the winter run programs at the Mad River and on the Russian River at Warm Springs. And this is really interesting because what is known about steelhead ocean ecology is that these winter runs are probably going far offshore, not staying in the California current and feeding with our Chinook salmon or our coho salmon. So that is a mystery that needs to be solved. For the Chinook, though, we have direct information from the fisheries in 2020, 2021, and 2022 from gut contents that their diet has been dominated by anchovies. That anchovies historically have always been a major part of salmon diets. And this graphic has appended our data onto the end of data that was assembled in a publication by Julie Thayer in 2014. And what is typical of these early years is just a lot of diversity. And that diversity would evolve through the season, that early in the year, especially krill, juvenile rockfish, herring, crab, megalope, sardines, and squid would be really abundant, transitioning over to sardines and anchovies in August and September. Our data show anchovies being super abundant and dominant in every month of sampling. The fisheries have been limited though, so we have May, June, July, August through October. This mock-up is just a way to kind of look at how that diversity has likely changed from the early years to what we see in recent years. And this is from the diets of fish that were caught between about Bodega Bay and Monterey, so Central Coast. And again, this is at the southern fringe of what we think of as the Klamath Basin Chinook distribution, and probably the southern fringe of coho salmon distributions from the North Coast. But I do know from just talking to fishermen that there was a lot of coho bycatch in 2021 and 2022, and just phenomenal numbers of anchovies. Like, we had the food, and the anchovies were the dominant thing in the food web. Here is just another depiction of how that has changed in recent years. That this is a coastal pelagic survey that does acoustics and trawls from Vancouver Island, in some years all the way down to Baja, run out of our La Jolla lab. The green circled areas are places where the anchovy have dominated that small pelagic community. And you could just see how that expanded in the period from 2017 to 2021. The biomass of this central stock of northern anchovy went from very, very low, a few tens of thousands of tons, to over 3 million tons now at record high biomasses. And you just look at the overlap with where we think Central Valley Chinook salmon are. It has increased with time. And if I were to draw the Klamath just a little bit north, it has also increased with time with this expansion of the population of anchovies. And you can see that there are small pelagics off of the northern half of California. It just tends to be jack mackerel that is the dominant species in recent years, plus herring up off the kind of the north end of the state. So, stepping back, we are at a point in time where the oceans are changing rapidly. And this is global. It's not just off the West Coast. The ocean temperatures globally have, just been setting extremely high, record levels, especially in 2023. And already this year, we're still up in this record area. The North Pacific as a whole also really shifted into a new place in about 2013-14, and just has stayed in these high values with big peaks in the summer. And here's a map of ocean temperatures from a couple days ago. The anomalies compared to the 1971 to 2000 average, and just a lot of red on that map. It's kind of interesting though that with all that warmth along the Northeast Pacific and sort of salmon country for the West Coast, it's not so bad right now compared to previous years, and we just have to see where this goes. And one idea is that with the end of the El Nino that has been around for about a year now, there is an expectation that this little blue band is going to expand and fill out, and we'll have the next La Nina to talk about this fall and winter going into early next year, and all that might bring. So, we might end up with a year where that La Nina influence does favor cold Northeast Pacific, in the pattern that might lead to more productive ocean for at least a year. But getting out further into the future, we're at the front end of global warming and ocean warming. There's a lot more in the pipeline, and it's just really expected to accelerate going into future decades. And this is a cross section of showing how data from the past going into the late 50s up until 2020 have played out. You just start to see this surface intensified accumulation of heat, and that is expected to continue. And what we know from our ecosystem observations in recent years, that this is already coming with a lot of disruption in marine food webs. And 2015 was a year where something like 30% of all the common murres in the Northeast Pacific died of starvation. One event from Alaska to California. And yeah, these events are changing the community structure of our oceans in ways that just aren't part of what is in any of our historical records. So it's hard to predict, where this is going. And with the anchovy boom, even that by itself has already thrown some kind of long-held beliefs upside down, that in previous research really suggested that the warm periods off the West Coast should come with sardine booming populations. But sardines have been scarce for about 15 years, and they're still scarce through this warm period. And it was the cold years with the strong upwelling supposed to fuel very productive anchovy years, but we got just the opposite in this last decade. So to me, I think we're really in this era of ecosystem surprises. We don't have a clear idea about where this is going, other than it is trending away from what we think of as productive salmon habitat, cold, nutrient-rich, subarctic water masses, into something that's more subtropical. And the species distributions are changing, and the relationships that these fish have with their environment is changing. So yeah, I think about just how our fish are going to have to adapt, and they have been faced with this really big adaptation challenge, not just on the freshwater side, but it's in the ocean too. And for that, I think the investment needs to go towards, how diverse, how robust and resilient can we make the production system on the freshwater side be, so that these fish can sort out what happens on the ocean side. So that's not a very happy story, but it's kind of where I think it is. So thank you.
I'm really torn saying great presentation with how sad that was, but
yeah,
in any case, very informative and like an eye opener for a lot of folks. We talk about the Columbia plume. It's amazing. All the research has been done by NIMS, the universities. We don't really talk about our plumes off the California coast. Now, and I don't see us having an effect on temperature on the coast, but that nutrient aspect of it, has that ever spun in your head about, since our salmon stay so close to the coast, how our inland waters and how productive they might be, and how we manage the flow so much that potentially we could have an effect on productivity? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. That there has been a bunch of research focused on the Columbia River plume as this early marine habitat that may be very important for Columbia River salmon and steelhead as they enter the ocean and start adjusting to life out there. Hydropower system and the dams in the Columbia Basin have altered the timing and the magnitude of the kind of spring peak and discharge that naturally occurred there. That's sort of a May, June, July snowmelt runoff peak that would create a really large freshwater lens that could be traced all the way down the coast and to Oregon and offshore. So that's been muted, and his timing has been altered. And to some extent, you have the same situation here, right? With water management, diversions, holding onto water, altering the hydrograph is doing the same thing. Not as big of a system, but it may be equally important for the fish and sort of their evolved timing for how they adjust to the ocean. But I don't know of any research that has been focused on that issue for the Klamath and Trinity. So yeah, I just don't know. And we're not engaged in anything like that right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Great presentation. I was just wondering if it's been shown or known if the distribution of anchovies or the movement of anchovies is associated with warming, or why people think that there's more northward. That's one question. And then the other question I had was, has there been any look at the change in distribution of Sacramento stocks, like over time, especially in recent decades? Because anecdotally, seems to me like they're more concentrated there, like they've moved less. So kind of two questions there.
Yeah. So on the anchovy question, I don't think that has been explained very well, why the anchovy stock has expanded so rapidly and become so abundant, and that its range has extended as far north as it has. I do know that, like in 2021, it did show high abundances and kind of food web dominance as far as Cape Mendocino. And then 2022, it sort of shrunk back a little bit south of Cape Mendocino again. And historically, that stock, the central stock, has been most abundant from about San Francisco south. So it does seem like with this very high biomass, we are in a situation where they are occupying, more northern waters than is typical for them. There are anchovy populations, in the lower Columbia and in the Salish Sea that have also become abundant during this warm period, but they're more localized and just they don't have the big biomass that this central stock off the West Coast has. For the Central Valley Chinook salmon, one of the limitations on knowing where they are and have been in recent years is just the really chopped up fisheries and just a very limited ocean fishing that's been going on and ocean captures. But we do know that the fishery performance has been unusually good for the abundance and for the number of days that it's been open, especially in 2022, but even the 5 years leading up to it, catch rates were higher than predicted based on models that looked at historical encounter rates and catch efficiencies. And something that some of my colleagues have been working on is sort of thinking about this compression of the cold and productive habitat spatially, that in these years where the offshore ocean is really warm, we do see still upwelling along the coast and really productive cold water in a narrow band right over the shelf, but it's sort of walled into a smaller area. And that might be compressing this favorable feeding area for Chinook salmon and making them more vulnerable to the fishery. So there's an effort to dig into that and try to make sense of how sensitive their ocean distribution is, how that might play out in the fishery effectiveness, and what that might mean for if we do open up our ocean fisheries again to sort of better handle that change relationship so that we don't overfish unintentionally.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for all that info. I was just wondering if you had any predictions as far as future climate change effects on the upwelling and the fog and those sort of nearshore coastal processes. If you think that's going to be pretty stable, like the whole ocean will just get warmer, but there'll still be upwelling, or if there might be some major shifts in circulation patterns and atmospheric flow that might just totally blow it up.
Sure. So yeah, the future of upwelling is a really important part of where the California current is headed in terms of its structure and its productivity. I just saw some of our NOAA colleagues in Monterey have published a new paper looking at not just how the wind is going to play out, but also the source waters that get upwelled. And that all I read was the abstract in this paper, but I'll pass it around so people can find it. But the punchline from that work suggests that those source waters vary quite a bit between the different future climate scenarios that come out of different modeling systems. And that is a big deal. If the nutrient concentrations increase dramatically, the carbon concentrations and dissolved oxygen drops, that makes a bigger ecological impact for a given amount of wind and upwelling. So that's a lot of uncertainty there. And then on the other hand, what's going to happen with the atmosphere and the winds, and different models have different answers. A number of them do suggest stronger upwelling at the northern half of the California current, so say Oregon and Washington, and maybe not so much change in Northern California and a reduction in the south, but it sort of varies from one model to the next. So I don't think that is sorted out. And then the future of fog is going to be locked up with that, because again, fog is a product of this interaction between the ocean surface and then what the atmosphere is doing.
So Nate, great talk. I was wondering about the anchovy issue for salmon. So in the Great Lakes, the alewife have this thiomenase. So is that part of what's being discussed or studied?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention that, but yes, the anchovies have an enzyme in their digestive tract. It's called thiomenase, and it destroys thiamine when it is released when an anchovy is digested in a salmon's stomach. And the salmon, they need to resupply their vitamin B1 through feeding all the time. And if they're just eating anchovies, like every meal is a loser on thiamine. We've looked at some of the nutritional characteristics of the dominant prey items, and anchovy are special for having really low vitamin B1 and really high thiomenase, so that not much of the good stuff and a lot of the bad stuff. Krill are just the opposite. Anchovy are also very lipid rich. So the salmon that I had pictured at the title slide is one that we caught sampling off of Tamales in 2022. And this is something that we see in fish in the last couple of years in Central California. The fish caught in the ocean look great. They are fat, round, deep-bodied, really thick belly walls. And just looking at them, you would think they're doing great. The ocean is treating these fish well. But, what we're finding is that these fish are passing on a big problem to their offspring, and that the fry survival rates in some cases have been knocked down by as much as 50% in recent years. A winter on Chinook last year and 2 years ago had low enough egg thiamine concentrations that there's 50% thiamine-dependent fry mortality in a lab setting, and likely sublethal effects on the survivors that may later on lower their fitness and reduce the reproductive success. And as Kurt said, they've seen this kind of thing happen in the Great Lakes and also in the Baltic Sea with Atlantic salmon. And in some of the worst years, just have reproductive failures for these populations. So it can be enough to really knock down the recruitment success. What we see in the Klamath Basin so far, the levels don't look to be that bad. The model that we developed based on the lab studies with Central Valley fish suggests maybe a few percent thiamine-dependent fry mortality. And I'm pretty sure that Lewiston Hatchery is prophylactically treating all of their juveniles, or either at the egg stage, at fertilization with a thiamine bath, or the adults spring run with a thiamine injection weeks before spawning, so that they are not going to suffer these direct effects. But the natural spawning populations may be suffering from it, and it's hard to see it unless you have a screw trap right downstream from natural spawning areas. You're just not going to see these swim up fry dying at high rates or swimming in unusual patterns. They actually did see that in the Feather River in 2020 and some of the screw traps just below the spawning areas.